Thank you so much, Iris. It was a few years ago. It's been since we moved to Greensboro that I had to go back to Charlotte to preach a funeral for a former church member, and it was just a graveside service. And I've done a lot of funerals, done a lot of graveside services over the years, but on that day I saw something done that I had never seen either before or since. And what I did was to do my part, did the talking part, prayed, greeted the family. And I'm thinking at this point we're kind of done when the cemetery rep directs the family to come out from underneath the tent over to this clearing area. And he's probably, 20, 25 feet from us. And at his feet, there is this large basket. And at this point, he talks about the Lord and how He exists as Father, Son, and Spirit. And then He raises the lid of the basket, and what appears to be 3 doves come out of that basket, and they begin to fly overhead. And then He talks about this woman who has just passed and how she knew and walked with the Lord, and she's finished her time on earth, and now she is gone to be with the Lord in heaven. And He raises the basket again, and another bird flies out and joins the other 3, and together, all 4 of them circle, and then they fly off together. I thought, that's really neat. That's interesting symbolism. And afterwards, I was talking to the cemetery rep, and I said, I've never seen anything like that. How these doves are flying like that. And I thought it was really neat how they circled all together. And at that point, he explained to me that they're not actually doves. They're homing pigeons. And what they had done is that there's a guy that raises them in Fort Mill, South Carolina. And so they pay him, and he brings a group of them up. And what happens is that when they are released, the 4 of them will circle around 3 or 4 times. And what they're doing is getting their bearings, and then they fly home. So they're in Charlotte, and then they'll fly all the way back to Fort Mill without GPS, without a map. It's just crazy. Now, he said sometimes a hawk will get them, but makes for a more interesting story. But it's just interesting, and it was so neat how these birds, and I don't know how, and I don't understand how it is that God made them, so that they can just circle, get their bearings, and then they go back to where they came from. They go back to where they actually belong. They go back to where and from whence they were actually sent. If you're here today as someone who says, you know what, I sincerely believe and am confident that I've got a personal relationship with the Lord. I'm a follower of Christ. I'm a Christian. If that is a true statement, and if it has been true for more than just a short period of time, in all likelihood, you have probably identified with one of those pigeons. And that is because of either choices that you made or circumstances you experienced, you wound up at a place far from where you could have been, far from where you should have been. In fact, it may be that that's true of where you are today. Now, it's not that God went anywhere, and it's not that all of this happened overnight, but step by step, what happened is that you got further and further and further and further from Him. And what you need is to get back to where you belong. What you need to do is to get back to where you could be and should be. Whether you're in that boat at this moment or tempted at some point in the future by virtue of choices or circumstances to get aboard that boat, the good news, I believe from the Lord, is this. You can return. You can have a comeback. You can get back to where you could have been, where you should have been. And that's the thrust of a new series that we're beginning today that I'm calling the Boomerang Effect. The Boomerang Effect. And for the next 5 weeks, we're going to be thinking about this and looking at it through the lens of an Old Testament king whose name was Josiah. And today we're going to look at the beginning of his story as he and the people that he leads wind up experiencing the boomerang effect, where they come back to God. They get back to the point and place where they could have been and should have been all along. Look with me in your Bibles today to 2 Kings 22. 2 Kings chapter 22. If you have trouble finding that, it's after 1 Kings. If you're running for president, it's also known as 2 Kings. That one was free. Before we read the text, I want to frame this thought, or get this thought framed up in your mind. You may very well need to experience a comeback. You may need very much to experience the boomerang effect, but it is entirely possible that you do not at this very moment know it. So how can you get to the point and place where you know, I need to get back to where I belong? 2 Kings 22, verse 1, we're told that, did I say 21? I'm sorry, 22, chapter 22. 2 Kings 22, Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedidiah, the daughter of Adiah of Bozkath. He did what was right in the eyes of the Lord and walked in the way of David his father, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. All right, to understand what it is that we're going to be looking at today and in the coming weeks, you need a bit of context to help all of this make sense. You recognize, hopefully, that prior to this, the people of God had existed as one singular nation, the nation of Israel. They had their first king, Saul. He was followed by David. And then David's son Solomon became Israel's third king. After Solomon's death, there's a split within the nation. And so what happens is that you have 10 tribes in the north that comprise Israel, and then there are 2 tribes in the south that comprise Judah. What we're reading about and what we're going to see in the coming weeks, all of this deals with the southern kingdom, the kingdom of Judah. Also keep this in mind. What we are reading here occurs 90 years after the Assyrians have already defeated Israel in the north. And so the people of God as a nation exist only as one nation at this point, the nation of Judah. And in verse 1, we're introduced to this man whose name is Josiah. In fact, when we're introduced to him, he's not a man, he's a boy. He is 8 years old. Well, not only is he 8 years old, but as an 8-year-old, he becomes the king of Judah. Well, how in the world does that happen? I mean, how do you wind up becoming a king at 8 years old? Well, if you go back to the end of chapter 21, you read about his father, whose name was Ammon. And Ammon had servants who conspired against him, and they assassinated him. So the king is dead. We need a new king, and by rights, that should follow his lineage. And so his son becomes king, even though he's just 8 years old. Among our plethora of children, I have an 8-year-old. He can't find his socks, much less run a country. I don't know if Josiah could find his socks or not, but he's running a country. Ready or not, he is king now. The reins of leadership and the throne has now been thrust upon him. So we just talked about his father's identity, and verse 1 tells us about his mother's identity. We're told also that he reigned in Jerusalem for 31 years, and his reign ended because he died. Josiah never got to see even his 40th birthday. But verse 2 gives us a summary of Josiah's life. It says of him that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He walked in the way of, or in keeping with the example of David, in that he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. All right? So you say, well, Michael, how can you make a sermon out of that? I can make a long one out of that. You ready? Look at verse 3, just the beginning of it. It says, in the 18th year of King Josiah. Just get that as a frame of reference. All right, so verse 1, he's 8 years old. Verse 3, he's 26 years old. 18 years have passed. And what's getting ready to occur in verse 3 is that Josiah is going to have a renovation of the temple. And it is this renovation of the temple that is going to start and jumpstart and kickstart this whole boomerang effect, where Josiah and the people that he leads wind up coming back to God with all of their hearts. But in verse 1, he's 8. In verse 3, he's 26. A lot happens between the ages of 8 and 26, doesn't it? Now, you think about your own experience. You grew a lot physically. You matured, hopefully, a great deal. You learned a lot. Beyond that, during those years, you tend to make some awfully important decisions that not only cast a shadow, but very much on a daily basis affect what you're going to experience for the rest of your life. In verse 1, he's 8. By verse 3, he's 26. Almost certainly, though, as verse 1 begins, he's an 8-year-old, and not simply by virtue of his age, but by virtue of the circumstances that he inherits, by virtue of the culture that he comes into. At 8 years old, this is not a young man that follows the Lord. He may know of God, but he doesn't know Him in a personal way. Almost certainly is not following Him. But then by verse 3, he and the people he leads are getting ready to experience this great comeback, this boomerang effect where they turn and return to the Lord with all of their hearts. But before that could ever happen, both Josiah and the people that he led had to realize something really important. I need it. I need it. This whole comeback, this whole boomerang effect, before they could ever experience it, they had to first discover that they needed it. Before you can experience it, you've got to first discover that you need it. How do you know? How can you tell if where you are is a place where you need to start spinning back and heading back to where you could and should have been all along? Well, there's a couple of questions based on what we see here that I think you can use to ask yourself, and that God can use to help you in answering, to let you know whether you need to experience that. And here's the first question. Whose path are you following? Whose path are you following? Verse 2 tells us of Josiah that he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. Right? This is effectively a summary statement, not just of the early years, but of the whole, the entirety of Josiah's life. But again, it says that he walked in the way of David. He walked in the way of David. Now, it's very easy to miss this, but one of the things that you've got to keep in mind is that there are a ton of years that separate Josiah and David. David lived much, 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 much earlier. In fact, after David, you have Solomon, then Rehoboam, Abijam, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, and then finally Josiah. 13 generations of kings passed between David and Josiah. Logically, you would think, as an 8-year-old, if Josiah is going to become king, that he's going to model himself, and the pattern or the example that he is going to follow is going to be most closely associated with that of his father. After all, his father is the only guy who, even for a short period of time, he got to personally observe and witness as a king. But that's not the path that he went. That's not the example that he followed. He did not follow even his own father's example. Why do you suppose that was? What kind of example did his father set? If you just look back a few verses back to the end of chapter 21, in verse 20, we're told this is Josiah's father. He did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, as Manasseh, his father, had done. Josiah's grandfather was a wicked man. His father was a wicked man. Josiah's father, verse 21, walked in all the way in which his father had walked. He served the idols that his father served and worshipped them. He abandoned the Lord, the God of his fathers, and did not walk in the way of the Lord. That's the shadow that his father cast. That's the example that his father had left. That's the path that Josiah very easily could have taken, but it's not the path that Josiah chose. The world, the environment, the circumstances into which Josiah came into, all he knew, all that he was exposed to was a culture of idol worship. A culture where you do whatever you want to. In particular, if it feels good, do it. You just kind of make up the rules and just live however it is that you want to. Except in terms of religious stuff, well, there's a God to this, a God to that, an altar to this, a temple to that. And so you need to go kind of tip your hat and not bow your head at each of those various places. That's what his father had done. That's what Josiah's grandfather had done. And very easily, it's a trap that Josiah could have fallen into and gotten stuck in. And quite frankly, between the ages of 8 and 26, in all likelihood, that's probably what characterized it. You know, because at 8 years old, he's going to now that he's king, he's going to have some of the same advisors that his father had, who guided, counseled, and directed his father. And since he's just 8 years old, they're going to be trying to put their thumb on him very heavily. And so Josiah, in all likelihood, just kind of kept the trains running on time, just kept the status quo going. And almost certainly, just as his father and grandfather had done, Josiah spends time at these pagan altars. Josiah bows at these pagan temples. But somewhere, as he's approaching the age of 26, he comes to a crossroads of reality, where he realizes that the man that I am, the life that I live, and the manner in which I lead, I'm going to be following someone's example. I'm going to be following someone's example. And the example I want to follow is not even my own father's. Here in America, we love to celebrate rugged individualism. We use phrases like, he is a self-made man, or she is a self-made woman. We like to describe in celebratory words people as they are trailblazers, or they are individuals who chart their own course. They chart their own path. They plow their own fields. And though you have been exposed to and are familiar with those phrases, and you may periodically even use them, understand this. In truth, none of those is an accurate statement. There really is among us no such thing as a trailblazer. There really is no such thing as a self-made man or a self-made woman. There just isn't. And do you know why? Because Solomon, many years ago, made this very plain in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9. There is nothing new under the sun. There really is. There is nothing new under the sun. Now, I get the fact, and you understand as well, that no two people have exactly the same circumstances and exactly the same opportunities and exactly the same eye for eye, T for T circumstances dealt to them. I understand that. But you must also understand this. Though that is true, it's also true that whatever you have experienced, at least in form, those who have gone on before you have already experienced. Whatever circumstance you are faced with, someone else has already experienced a very nearly identical circumstance. Whatever opportunity that you are on the cusp of experiencing, someone already has been down a path very, very similar. Because of that, whether consciously or otherwise, every single one of us in every aspect of our lives is following someone's example. The type of husband or wife that you are is patterned or modeled after someone. The type of employee that you are and the manner in which you do your job and do your work is following someone's example. Everything that we do, someone before us has already been there, done that, and got the t-shirt. So, with that in mind, at the end of the day, you and I must come to grips with this reality. My life is going to be lived following someone's example, and so that means I've got important choices to make. At 8 years old, so much was simply thrust upon young Josiah, but after a period of years, through experience and the process of maturing, he came also to the same realization. What I do, the life that I live, and the manner in which I lead, it's going to be in keeping with someone's example. And I don't want it to be like my father's. I want it to be somebody like David. Right now, in the various aspects of life, you're following someone else's already established example. But with that in mind, understand this. Before the boomerang experience can become your own, before a comeback can ever occur, you've got to first realize whose example you're following. Why do I say that? Because if you're following someone else's example, and you are, you've got a good idea of how the story unfolds. You're following someone else's example, and by virtue of that fact, you've got a good idea of how the story is going to unfold. I was in high school when I first felt the call of God on my life to serve Him in vocational ministry and to be a pastor. And so after high school, went on to college and then later on to seminary, but started in college to begin the process of theological training. And it was during my years in college that I first got some occasions or opportunities or invites to be able to fill in, do some pulpit supply, and to actually preach. And man, I was so excited to have these opportunities. I relished these things. And sometimes I would know weeks in advance, sometimes months in advance. And I was so excited to have some date on my calendar where I was going to be preaching somewhere. And though I was so deeply excited, I also had a vexing problem. You know what it was? I didn't really know how to preach. That tends to be a problem. No one had ever said to me, Michael, here's some tips, here's some pointers, here's some stuff that you may want to think about as you approach a passage to kind of break it apart, to deliver a message. Here's some things that you may want to consider. I'd not read a book on sermon prep and delivery. At that point, I'd not had any classes dealing with preaching. All I had was excitement, opportunity, and nothing else. I didn't know what I was doing. I had nothing. Well, almost nothing. What I did have was a preaching hero. And at that point in my life, my preaching hero was Adrian Rogers. Many of you are familiar with him. He's since gone on to be with the Lord. But Adrian Rogers was the pastor of Bellevue Baptist in Memphis, which is, even today, it's a monster church. But while he was there, this is a church whose membership exceeded 30,000. It's a monster church. And Adrian's messages from the previous week were broadcast every Sunday morning at 11 o'clock. Well, the problem was I was in church myself. The good thing is we had these antique things called a VCR. You ever heard of one of those? Had these big tape things. You have to explain it to your children later. Anyway, so while I'm at church, I'm recording. The program is called Love Worth Finding. And so every week I'm going to record Love Worth Finding and to record Adrian Rogers' sermon. That afternoon or the next night, I'm going to sit down and I'm going to watch this thing. And I don't just watch these messages. I am sitting there and I am taking prodigious notes. I'm writing, and in fact, I would have to pause, rewind. Let me get that right. Let me give it. And so it's almost as if I'm writing a transcript of these sermons. And I did this week after week after week after week. Well, I loved how he communicated. I loved how he thought through a text. I liked to listen to his sermons, and very many of those early sermons that I ever preached, you know who they sounded an awful lot like? Well, they sounded an awful lot like, in fact, they were his sermons is what they were. They were his sermons. But understand me in this, it was not accidental. It wasn't accidental at all. I had, and at that point was still hearing from a lot of other different preachers, but I didn't sound, and my sermons at that point did not sound at all like theirs. Why? Because I was intentionally following a particular example. And why was I following that example? Because I liked the path that it led down. I wanted to follow a path that led to that type of destination. Understand me in this. You and I are each doing the same thing. For some of you and in some aspects of your life, it's intentional. I mean, you have thought, hey, I want to be a mom like my mother was, or I want to be a dad like my father was, or I want to be employed like the person who first taught me when I came to this company. You're intentionally following some other example. In other cases, in other aspects of your life, it may be less conscious, but nevertheless real. You are following someone's lead, and if you'll stop long enough and be intentional enough in asking God to give you the discernment, He will help you see the path that you're following, the example that you are trailing. And you will need that. Why? Because when you recognize who you're following, you can tell which direction you're going and whether that is a direction that is leading you to or away from God. Ask yourself, if you want to know, do I need to experience the boomerang effect? Well, I've got to answer, who is it that I'm following? Who is my life kind of modeled and patterned after? As a mom, a dad, as a husband, a wife, an employee, as a pastor, as a Sunday school teacher, who am I following? And when you can answer that question, it'll let you know, am I headed to or away from God? And if you're headed away, you need the boomerang effect. But there's another question that you need to answer, and that's this. Does your story need a different ending? Does your story need a different ending? So much of my life and yours is determined by the choices that you make. The job that you have, or the job that you have or had that because you accepted an offer of employment. Nobody's making you work for this particular company or that one. You accepted the job offer. If you went to college, you went to that college because you chose to do so. In fact, even how much you weigh, whether that's a lot or a little, is due to your choices. Your choices about diet and exercise. Right? So much of our lives is directly a result of the choices that we make. I know that. You know that. But you and I also understand this. Not every part of our life is the fruit of our choices. There are some things that are outside the confines of our control. There are some things that we didn't get any say-so in. And very much there is a sense in which there's a part of our life that's part of a hand that we are dealt. For example, you don't get any say-so as to where it is that you were born or to whom it was you were born to. You don't necessarily get any say-so as to what educational opportunities will even be an option for you. You don't get any say-so as to what type of gene makeup you have and whether that makes you more or less disposed to cancer or Alzheimer's or some other disease. We don't get any say-so in that. And in many ways, a big chunk of our life is just a part of a hand that we're dealt. And at 8 years old, Josiah was dealt an enormous hand. He's handed the keys to the kingdom. He's handed the throne. Hey, you're 8 years old. Happy birthday. You're king. Not only, though, was he dealt responsibility that he didn't choose, he was also dealt a spiritual environment that he did not create. He was dealt a spiritual environment that he did not create. The spiritual environment into which Josiah came into can be described as with two words: wicked and dark. Wicked and dark. Throughout the nation of Judah, there were altars erected to all sorts of false and pagan gods. Throughout the country, there were slews of temples erected to all sorts of pagan gods and deities. And even among the people who were supposed to be the people of God, there was a group, though seemingly pretty small, that were worshiping the god Molech. And the next chapter reveals this to us. They were offering human sacrifices to Molech. These are supposed to be the people of God, but they're very much not. That was all part of the hand that Josiah was dealt. Josiah didn't start it, he inherited it. And as he assumes the reins of leadership, that's all he knows. That's what he was familiar with. And in almost certainty, from the ages of 8 until 26, that's what he probably did as well. Almost certainly he spent his fair share of time at these various altars and temples to these various false and pagan gods. He didn't create it. He inherited it, but he very much became a part of it. And from 8 until 26, all of this was occurring now on his watch. That was Josiah's start. He was supposed to be the king of God's people, but they were anything but God's people. But then, though that was his start, he and the people that he leads begin to experience what I'm describing as the boomerang effect. And they began, first he himself, but then the people as well, to return to God with their full heart. They came back to God, and the good news is this: though that was their start, though that was his start, he got a different ending. Verse 2 gives us, as Paul Harvey describes, essentially the rest of the story of Josiah. That he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. He did not turn aside to the right or to the left. I don't know if you're realizing this, but that should come as some awfully, awfully good news to you. It comes as good news to me. Because there's a lot of stuff that we have in the rearview mirror that we can't change. A lot of dumb stuff that we've done. A lot of bad choices that we've made. And you can feel sorrow and regret and remorse and even guilt over those things, but none of those emotions changes any of that. All of that has been written with pen and ink, and there's no erasing. You can't undo your start. Some of you would say, you know what, I might have had a good start, but I've had a lousy middle. You can't undo the middle either. If it's behind you, you know this. It cannot be changed. That stinks. But the good and encouraging news is this. You can have a different ending. You can have a different ending. Back a few years ago, I shared with you in part a story of when Nathan was much younger. This was back when we were in Charlotte, and I was putting him to bed that night. And as I'm putting him to bed, Nathan said, "Daddy, will you tell me a bedtime story?" I'd never actually told him like a bedtime story before. And so I thought, well, okay, I can do that. And so I started, and I tried to go through my inventory of bedtime stories, and I didn't really think of anything except Little Red Riding Hood. And so I started. You know the story. Little Red Riding Hood is going to grandmother's house, and before she gets there, the big bad wolf has tied grandmother up, put her clothes on, jumps in her bed. Little Red Riding Hood comes in there, and she sees what she thinks at first is her grandmother, and she says, "My, what big ears you have." "Well, the better to hear you with." "My grandmother, what big eyes you have." "Well, the better to see you with." "My grandmother, what big teeth you have." "Well, the better to eat you with." So I'm going along. I'm telling this with much dramatic fanfare and flourish. No, I'm not. Anyway, so I'm telling the story, but I'm telling it well. And at that point, I get a problem. Because once the big bad wolf says, "the better to eat you with," I could not remember how the story ended. And I didn't, because Nathan's all into it, and I didn't want to say, well, I don't remember how it ended. And so I just keep going. And so I said, the big bad wolf jumped up and ran after Little Red Riding Hood, and she ran out of the house, and she's trucking it through the woods. She's going as fast as she can, and off in the distance, she sees a house made out of straw. She goes inside, and there's a pig who lives there, and so the big bad wolf beats on the door. "Let me in." Pig says, "Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin." "Well, if you don't, I'll huff and puff and blow your house down." So he huffs and puffs. He blows the house made out of straw down. And now the pig and Little Red Riding Hood are running for their lives. And they see a house in the distance, one made out of sticks. And so the wolf blows that one down. Finally, they run to a third pig's house, a house made out of brick. And the wolf huffed and puffed, and he blew with all of his might. And I got real dramatic. Then he'd huff and puff and huff and puff, and blew with all his might. And then he'd huff and puff and huff and puff and huff and puff, and blow with all his might. But he just couldn't. And finally, he got so out of breath and so tired that he just went home. That's pitiful. Anyway, you may very well say, "Michael, you idiot." That's not how the story goes. To that, I would say this: I don't care. You know why? Because it's my story. And I get to determine how my story ends. There's some good news in that, isn't there? Understand me in this. Every single one of us is writing a story with our lives, with the circumstances that we make, experience, and the choices that we make. And for some of you, there's a lot of chapters that are already written. Some of you are still very early on in the book, but every single one of us has some chapters that are already written that we cannot change. You cannot change the beginning. You cannot change the middle, but what you've got every opportunity to do is to change the ending. Josiah could not change the start. He could not change the middle. But with God's help, he was able to change the ending. And what he and the people of God experienced was this tremendous boomerang effect where they returned with all of their hearts to a God that made them, to a God that loved them. And they only experienced it after they realized that they needed it. Your life is telling a story There's chapters that are already written with pen and ink. But what type of story ending do you want it to have? Let me ask you this. Do you want it to sound something like this? He did not. She did not turn aside to the right or to the left. That only happens when you experience the boomerang effect. Will you bow your heads with me? It's entirely possible when you showed up here this morning, you thought, everything in my life is just fine. Not great, not awful, but things are just fine. But perhaps as we have looked at the pages of God's Word this morning, that He, through His Spirit, has helped you to see that things are not fine. Where you are in your life, and more particularly where you are in your walk with Him, is not what could or should be. You have had God to help you see you need the boomerang effect. And I'm not saying that in its entirety can happen today, but you can say this: Lord, where I am is not where I want this story to end. I want a life that's described like Josiah's was. And right now, that's not true. If my life ended today, that can't be the descriptive. But I'm willing to follow you and listen. I'm ready to get serious about this so that me and my heart and my life can be following, not simply good examples, but ultimately following you. And I'm willing today to take the first step in a process. You didn't arrive where you were overnight, and it's not going to change overnight. For Josiah and the people of God, it was not the flipping of a switch. There was a process that began when they started to discover, I need this. I need this. Is that you this morning? Well, if it is, in just a moment, maybe you just want to, perhaps in your pew, but maybe you just want to kneel at this altar and say, Lord, I don't know exactly where all this is going to take me, but I realize where I am is not where I need to be. I need to begin the process of returning back to you. God can do something with that. He can do something significant with that. Will you make that choice? Maybe you're here and you say, well, you know what, Michael? I don't know if there's a God for me at this point to get back to. I know of Him. I know things about Him. But in truth, I can't say that I've got a personal relationship with Him that has diminished over time because it hasn't existed. If that's the case, will you allow us to share with you this morning? Maybe you want to come and share with me during this invitation time, or at least find me after the service and say, Michael, what you're talking about, I need this. I need to find out more about this. If that's you, will you respond? Maybe there's just something else God's put on your heart you need to talk to Him about. This is your opportunity. And Lord, we just want to say together, thank you for your word and how it speaks to us. It shows us not only who you are, it shows us who and where we are. For some, we are in a place where we shouldn't be. Our walk with you is right now at a destination that it should not be at. And you're helping us to see we need to come back. We need the boomerang effect. And as you've spoken to our hearts, give us the courage to respond. We ask it in Christ's name. Amen. I'm going to ask if you would to stand. Our praise team is going to lead us in the hymn of invitation.